that the first Americans came through the ice-free corridor once and for all. People must have got to the Americas long before the corridor appeared.
But how did people get here when the way down through North America was blocked by solid ice?
Well, maybe I've just been missing the obvious. And there was another way we could have reached this continent.
Up until now, I've assumed that people got into the Americas from the north, from Beringia. But what if they didn't? What if they came straight from Asia, from across the ocean? Then the ice sheets wouldn't have even been an issue. Is it really such a crazy idea?
If the forefathers of those early South Americans couldn't have arrived through the ice-free corridor, then maybe they did come across the Pacific. And if they did, that might explain one of the great mysteries of our human journey.
I'm back in Brazil, this time in Rio de Janeiro, where I'm going to see some very ancient human remains that I'm hoping will shed some light on this idea of a migration across the Pacific.
So precious are these remains that they've been kept for 30 years under lock and key at Brazil's National Museum.
This beautiful skull has been nicknamed Luzia. It belonged to a woman who was in her early 20s when she died, and it dates to around 13,000 years ago. But it's not just the date that I'm interested in. It's what she looks like.
Anthropologist Walter Neves believes that he's uncovered a secret about Luzia.
Well, this is Luzia's skull, and the bad news are that she doesn't look like she should look like.
So what would you expect her to look like?
Well, as you know, Native Americans came from East Asia, and I will show you a typical skull from East Asia. And as you can see, they have very different faces. One of the greatest differences in terms of facial morphology happens in the cheekbones. You see that Asians, they have a very wide cheekbones,
yes.
Okay, kind of laterally projecting.
Yes, it gives this very wide face, doesn't it, across the cheekbones?
Yeah. If you go to Luzia, you'll find kind of narrow cheekbones.
OK, if Luzia and her population don't look like East Asians and they don't look like modern Native Americans, who do they look like?
We discovered that, amazingly, she looks much more like Australasians than with East Asians or Native Americans, if you want.
Australasian? It sounds bizarre. But Walter found that Luzia had more similarities with Australasian skulls than any others. And when Luzia's features are reconstructed, it's even more obvious that she looks nothing like modern Siberians or Native Americans. It suggests a superhuman feat of seafaring.
So if these early Americans look more like Australians and Melanesians, does that mean that they arrived here across the Pacific?
No. Because if you take into account the technology available like 12, 13,000 years ago, that would be impossible.
OK, but then how do you explain the fact that modern living Native Americans don't look like Luzia? They do look like East Asians.
That's very easy to explain. Because if you go back to Asia, around 14,000 years ago, The people that live today in Asia with their typical morphology, they were not there.
Right. So you're saying that Lucia's people came into the Americas before the appearance of East Asian features?
Definitely, definitely. But they used the same route as the Mongoloids did a couple of thousand years later.
So this is absolutely not evidence for any sort of trans-Pacific crossing?
Definitely not across the sea.
Walter is adamant that Stone Age people could not have made it across the Pacific. He believes Lucia's ancestors did come from Asia, but before those classic East Asian features became common.